Good afternoon and welcome to the inaugural Hurst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. My name is Evan Zislis. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for the Aspen Institute's Hurst Community Initiative. The work of HCI is focused on promoting dialogue, increasing understanding, and facilitating opportunities for meaningful collaboration among the communities of Aspen to Parachute, Colorado, located on ancestral lands of the Northern Ute people. Today is the fifth event of an 8-part speaker series in a collaboration with the regional public libraries and chambers of commerce of Aspen, Basalt, Carbondale, Glenwood Springs, Newcastle, Silt, Rifle, and Parachute. Every 2 weeks from now until the end of July, you can tune in to learn more about the issues facing our communities and the local experts working to find collaborative solutions to the shared challenges of our region. Today's topic is Housing Insecurity and Homelessness, a Regional Spectrum, co-hosted by the Glenwood Springs Branch Library and the Glenwood Springs Chamber Resort Association. Today's Zoom host is Garfield County Libraries, and interpretation to Spanish is brought to you by Velasco Language Services. Alex, if you would, please share for everyone how to access English and Spanish translation.
Of course, thank you. Thank you, Evan. Let me just share my screen so I can go over the functions. Welcome, everybody. We are using the Zoom webinar platform. We have a couple of ways we can communicate. We do have a chat box open. If you have any quick comments for our panelists, or if you need any help with the technical aspect of Zoom, this is the place to do it. I will be keeping an eye on the chat and I will be helping you as soon as I can if you do have any issues. The Q&A function is the best way to ask any questions of the panelists or the presenters. The Q&A box will save your question until we can get back to it at an appropriate time. If you need any help with these functions, please let me know through the chat. We are also interpreting this simultaneously to Spanish. You're going to see at the bottom right of your Zoom menu a gridded globe icon that says interpretation. Make sure to click on that and pick the language of your choosing, either English or Spanish. If you're getting some audio interference, make sure you click on mute original audio. Again, if you need any help with these functions, please use the chat and we'll get you set up as soon as we can. With that, I'll give it back to Evan.
Thanks, Alex. For today's webinar, as Alex mentioned, please use the chat feature for technical questions. You may ask questions for our panel using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I want to introduce our moderator for today's discussion. Chris Estes is the Associate Director for Aspen Institute's Community Strategies Group. Chris joins the Aspen Institute this year with strong policy expertise and practical experience at the local, state, and federal levels on poverty, housing, and community development. For 5 years, Chris was president and CEO of the National Housing Conference in Washington, D.C., where he was a national thought leader on affordable housing and community development issues, including the intersection of housing with transportation, education, and health. Chris originally came to D.C. from North Carolina, where he led the North Carolina Housing Coalition for 9 years. Chris is a graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he majored in economics and industrial relations. He holds 2 master's degrees from UNC Chapel Hill in social work and city and regional planning. He recently ended 7 years of service on the board of directors of the Baltimore branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond and 9 years as a board member of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Joining Chris today are esteemed panelists, Hannah Klausman, Debbie Wilde, and Katherine McKay. Hannah Klausman is Senior Planner for the City of Glenwood Springs. Hannah has a master's degree in Community and Regional Planning from the University of Oregon. Her community development background includes 2 years in the Peace Corps in Mongolia, 2 years with AmeriCorps, and international work with the U.S. State Department in Japan. She moved to Colorado in 2013 and has been working as a senior planner for the City of Glenwood Springs for the last 5 years. Hannah is the staff liaison to the city's Housing Commission and a member of the regional task force working on Groin Fork housing issues. Debbie Wilde is special projects facilitator on homelessness and substance use disorders for the city of Glenwood Springs. Debbie Wilde has a master's degree in nonprofit management from Regis University and degrees in sociology and psychology from Colorado State University. For the past 39 years, she has worked alongside the people of our region to improve the well-being of individuals, families, and communities. In the spring of 2019, the city of Glenwood Springs appointed Debbie to explore the growing issue of homelessness. Debbie works as a special projects facilitator for homelessness and substance use disorders and is a member of the Pitkin, Garfield, and Eagle County Built for Zero team, whose focus is ending chronic and veteran homelessness in our region. And lastly, Katherine McKay. Katherine is Senior Program Manager at the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program, where she leads the Expanding Prosperity Impact Collaborative, or EPIC, a research initiative focused on solving the most consequential, urgent financial challenges facing US households. Since 2016, she has led the Financial Security Program's research on income volatility, consumer debt, and housing security, and contributed to the program's work on inclusive savings and wealth building. Katherine is also a member of the Silver Spring Citizens Advisory Board in Montgomery County, Maryland, and works on issues including housing, affordability, pedestrian safety, and accessibility for people with disabilities. We're honored to have everyone joining us today. Chris, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Evan, and thanks again for having me here. I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. Our goal today is to really talk about the issues in Glenwood Springs around the issue of housing in a way that helps people connect it, whether you're someone who's looking for to find housing that's more affordable to what your income is, or trying to understand some of the challenges the community is experiencing due to a growth in population and a demand to live in a community, but also experiencing some of the challenges of lack of affordability, too much traffic, difficulty finding workers, and things like that, and how all those issues connect to other issues like how kids do in school, our overall quality of life, and the health and well-being of our residents in general. So with that, we're going to start with Hannah to give us a background a little bit about where we are in Glenwood Springs on housing, and particularly discussing the regional housing study that was recently completed. So with Hannah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Evan. I'm very honored to be here on this panel today with so many esteemed colleagues on this very challenging topic. I'm actually going to start a timer so that, since I think we can all talk about this for weeks on end, but we've only got an hour. Really kind of touching base on what we've got going on the municipal side. I am a senior planner for the city, so we see development coming in, and we also recently completed a regional housing study, I guess in 2018 now, that has some really key takeaways on what the need is in Glenwood and where we're possibly going in the next 10 to 15 years. So something we saw come out of that regional housing study, which was a large area. It included Aspen to Parachute. It also included parts of Eagle County, because we work as a regional area when it comes to housing. So we wanted to have all those players involved. Specifically for the city of Glenwood Springs, we saw a 2,000 unit housing shortfall, and that is expected to continue into 2027. That was the project parameters at that time. And what's interesting about a 2,000 unit shortfall for Glenwood is that went all across the spectrum on income levels. So it wasn't just the lowest income levels that we were seeing shortfalls, but also what's often referred to as the missing middle. So townhouses and duplex and infill projects, we're missing a lot there, and even in some of the higher income ranges as well. So a 2,000 unit shortfall was what Glenwood came out of that with. And some of the other aspects of that the housing study went into in great detail is what that means for the city as well as the region. And one of the things I like to point out is what that is costing our region. So with that shortfall and how many families aren't able to afford housing here, The study estimated that the region loses approximately $54 million in lost revenue due to cost burdened households. So a huge economic piece that plays in there when you're thinking about people that are not able to afford housing or not find housing or then get into housing that's above their income category. What happens there for the economy? So we have that 2,000 unit shortfall. People that are familiar with Glenwood Springs know that we're geographically constrained land-wise, so there's not a whole lot of buildable area, which also causes land prices to go up and feeds into affordable housing issues. We have had quite a lot of development come in, and this has been an interesting topic of conversation in the community as we've had some very large rental apartment complexes come in. The Red Canyon, or excuse me, the lofts at Red Mountain, which is over in the Target area, they've had several phases and we've brought in quite a few units there. Also Six Canyons and Buffalo Valley, which is just outside of Glenwood Springs. And so the amount that we're bringing in development wise is sitting at about 1,300 units. And we've had that topic come up. Great, you've brought in 1,300 units, you had a 2,000 unit housing shortfall. Looks like you guys are doing awesome, which there's a lot of nuance there that gets left off. And from those projects, you know, they are coming in at the higher income levels. So we haven't seen a whole lot coming in at that lower shortfall area that we've seen and that we would like to see come in. And also with those projects, I just did some quick check-ins on occupancy. All of those units are reporting 100% occupancy with fairly lengthy wait lists in all of their unit types, which spans from studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, and then we've got some 3-bedroom units as well. And all of those apartment complexes say they have very long wait lists in each and every category. So this speaks to, yes, we have had quite a bit of development come in, but there's still a large need. And that shortfall is going to continue as Glenwood Springs grows and into 2027. So there was some assumed growth there to begin with. So what does that mean for the city? As we're seeing more projects come in, we're adding units. You talk about a little of community character and where the community wants to be. And this is a interesting conversation to have in Glenwood Springs. And I think it's coming to the forefront about what Glenwood Springs wants to look like from a community perspective, from a municipal planning perspective, and also on the other piece, the developer perspective, so what they're bringing in. And we've had some challenging discussions over development in our community about density, the big D word that's hard to talk about and can be very emotional, of maintaining a small town character. We were talking before, Glenwood Springs is about 10,000 people. A lot of people live here for the beautiful amenities, the rural setting, access to recreation. And they're worried that with too many people coming in and larger developments, that might impact that character. And so we have a lot of conversations in the community development department about how do we incorporate density and still maintain a livable area that people want to call home. So we are, I would say we're in the midst of having that conversation with the community. We have a comprehensive plan update that's going to happen that will involve a lot of community engagement. And I think this is going to be at the top of the list for what gets discussed. This very big question of a certain amount of growth is going to happen, a certain amount of growth in terms of affordable housing, as the housing study indicates, needs to happen if we do want to accommodate those demographics. And how do we marry these two so that our community remains this amazing place to live, but we make it an amazing place to live for all of our employees, all of our workforce. And that's a very challenging topic. But that's what we do here in community development. And that's what I think most everyone here on this panel is working on. I think that was about, where I wanted to get on where we're at, I think one last thing that I'll mention, obviously the past year that we've had has been crazy. The housing study was done in 2018. There's some new variables that have emerged since then, obviously, with the pandemic and demographics moving in and out of rural and urban areas, and also what this has handed our business community. We've had a housing shortage for some time, and our businesses have been dealing with that and wanting to find creative solutions, public-private partnerships, and other ideas to house their workforce. And the pandemic, I would say, has exacerbated that even further. And so what we're witnessing from our business owners is they're not able to hire anyone right now. And the housing is a big piece of that. I think those of us who live in the area all know, if you're hiring someone, the first thing you want to ask is, have you looked at the pricing for housing in the area? Are you comfortable with it? Have you tried to find something? And so it's a big challenge for people, for our businesses to hire talented individuals all across the spectrum, and for them to actually find a viable place to live. And we're getting that story from our business community very strongly right now. Owners are covering 5 shifts because they don't have enough people. And they're searching for even more creative ideas in the short term, as well as the long term, and actually building something. But we have a large issue, and so we need all the brains in the area to collaborate on this so that we can work together to try and get to the city of Glenwood Springs shortage and the regional area shortage, which was quite large as well. So I think with that was about 10 minutes or so, high level. I will kick it back to you, Chris, if there's any questions on any of that, or other aspects that people want to pick up and talk from there.
So thank you, Hannah. What I want to do now, I want to bring Katherine in to make some comments about that, but I will sort of set 2 points that I think are sort of macro issues that the country has gone through. And we've really gone through 2 significant economic shocks in the last 12 years or 15 years or so that were significant for housing across the country, and particularly in places where people are wanting to live. That there are certainly places in the country that have experienced population loss, but in places that are growing, we saw this run up in home ownership during that led up to the financial crisis, where there was a growing rental housing crisis happening, but it was largely hidden by the economic boom at that time and the fixation of folks getting into mortgages and banks trying to keep that going, and sort of got us into trouble with the collapse of the financial markets. But that rental crisis was already happening well in the 2000s because we had really not kept up the production and really the prioritization of communities to build enough rental housing. It was seen to be preferable to have more home ownership. We got very fixated on wealth creation, and people realized you could make a lot of money on the home ownership market, and so there were new tools coming out and financial tools that got us into some trouble. And then coming out of the financial crisis, the entire construction industry really collapsed, and particularly the contracting industry. And so that exacerbated the housing supply issue because we simply weren't building housing for a long time. And then as we came back into it, we were generally building at higher end price points where the market there was a clear demand and easier to sort of get financing if you're a developer for that product. And so that has now exacerbated, even prior to COVID, we had really sort of began to come to terms with the rental crisis in our urban areas across the country. And slowly in communities like Glenwood, which have this sort of recreational tourism element, high quality of life, people want to live here, as well as the jobs that tourism economies support don't often pay very high wages. And so it already creates a sort of tension, not including the jobs that actually pay pretty well. When you don't have enough housing, those folks get priced out. So we've been in sort of a double whammy. And then the third is that when COVID hit, the prices, the inputs that go into housing construction have escalated dramatically. And so the price to actually build housing is more expensive than it's ever been. And that's not even counting access to the land. So we have some macro factors that lots of places across the country are dealing with. And they've been happening over, you know, a 10 to 15 to 20 year period that's had implications for homelessness, implications for rental housing, implications for first-time homebuyer homes, and things like that. So with that, I want to bring Katherine into the conversation, and Katherine to share some of your perspectives on the background that Hannah gave around Glenwood and sort of some of your thoughts about what you see going on.
Yeah, thank you all for including me today. So a lot of what you said, Hannah, is you know, familiar to what we hear from communities all over the country. There are basically, you know, a pretty wide variety of types of places, and places that are smaller, semi-rural, but growing and have a lot of demand for people to live there really have been struggling with housing costs in their communities in a way that often was not associated with those areas before maybe the last 20 years in a lot of places. As Chris was saying, like, the crisis that did exist was primarily confined to renters and primarily lower income renters. But one of the things that we saw as we were researching that issue is that at least since 2005, renters' incomes have consistently stayed about the same. Inflation adjusted, they went up about 10%, but inflation adjusted costs of rent went up about 20%. And given that context, it's just an increasing squeeze. And that means that the problem has become a little bit harder to solve and more acute. So the idea of needing to ensure that you can have a strong workforce that is able to really invest in your community and stay is something that, you know, housing is a huge part of that in a lot of places. And it sounds like you are thinking about all of the right things and you know, considering like, okay, how do we maintain this wonderful community that we have, but also be realistic about what we need to do to maintain it beyond just hope that we kind of stay still. Growth will happen, like you said, one way or another. And the best way to have a prosperous, successful community is for everyone to have an opportunity within the community to succeed. And sometimes hard work and a decent job just doesn't get you there because housing costs are so high, which is one of the reasons that we're also seeing homelessness rates rise among people who are working.
Thanks, Katherine. I'm gonna use that segue to bring Debbie in and come back to Katherine as Debbie talks as well. But Debbie, you've long looked at, I think, some of the human costs to housing issues in terms of what it means for families and children, for folks trying to find housing, and particularly folks who are working and still struggling to find housing. Talk a little bit about your work with in Glenwood and sort of what you all are seeing as some of the state of where we are right now.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, you know, I want to say, connected to what Hannah has said, the piece about that we sort of forget maybe a little bit or haven't recognized very well is that homelessness, the biggest reason that we have homelessness is housing. Lack of housing that people can afford and or units even to get to, right? So we put a lot of other kinds of things onto homelessness. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to look at in our community. And as I started into this just a couple of years ago, when the city of Glenwood said, what is happening with homelessness? And let's take a look at it. And that came out of, in a public meeting, there was a statement that if we didn't have all these services that we have, which I will share with you what we do have, which is quite limited, we wouldn't have homelessness. That homelessness is, in fact, people are coming here because we do have a meal 5 days a week in the evening, and we have a food pantry. We have a little bit of help with Salvation Army. We had Catholic Charities who would help some with rental assistance and or some vouchers, as we understand some of the language. But that if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have homelessness. And I think that's really a big sort of recognition or realization for us that, in fact, what you talked about, Katherine, that what we're seeing more and more, and is very real for our community, is these aren't people who need a job and that's going to take care of everything. These are people who are working. These aren't people who need different education. These are our college students who are camping in the forest, trying to get more training and get a better education. These are families. These are teenagers who are couch surfing and or camping out. These are, yes, in fact, we do have those who have mental health issues or substance abuse issues, right? And who have really gotten into very difficult space of trying to, for some, then camping on the hillside, and for some, even that is a far reach, right? And so we see people sleeping under the bridge, if you would. And that's the part that stirs people up in the community and that we think of as homelessness. And for many, it has remained on that substances, mental health piece, and not thinking about the whole continuum of homelessness. So I'm sure that's something that you, Katherine and Chris, can really speak more to. We see that very much here. We have these very few limited resources, if you would, as opposed to so many resources. And what people in our community have maybe forgotten, and it's kind of interesting to think about, is that the resources that we had really came out of when we had an economic boom in the west end of Garfield County with oil shale. And people came in droves for jobs, and there was not housing yet, and it couldn't keep up with the demand for that. And people were living in tents, and people didn't have access to food. They were standing in line trying to get a job. And hence the faith-based community sort of responded and was the most agile response, right? And built things like Lift Up, which became our food pantries, et cetera. It came together, made a nonprofit. That is sort of the history of our response to the community. And I see in many rural communities that the faith-based community, which has very limited resources, are the ones who've been for all these years kind of, if you would, limping along with wonderful hearts trying to feed and clothe people. But in the meantime, just as you all have already mentioned, this gap of lack of housing and ability to get enough up on your feet in order to attain housing has just continued to grow to where it just we can't not see it anymore. We know people are living in their cars, but that's part of our workforce. So I think all of this comes together. I told Hannah, the more that we really help those who are homeless get into places to live, right, also bumps into our whole strategy of housing and housing needs. Just as we said, it's across everywhere. So we really, I think one of the things that I also want to say is that in the sense of looking at homelessness, we do focus on some of those really difficult things like substance abuse, mental health. But what we haven't learned, because we are so new to this as a community, to even recognizing that we have homelessness or what causes it or what are the pieces of it, is something you all can speak to again too, that I have learned about, and that is that whole strategy of housing first. That if in fact you don't have a stable environment or a place to lay your head, it is very difficult then to deal with all of these other kinds of things, even the kinds of things like children being in school, right? And being able to pay attention in school, people doing a good job when they're at their place of employment. So these are the kinds of things that I think you're alluding to, Chris, too, that trickle out into other places. We understand Maslow's hierarchy in some ways, that we need that security piece. We've thought about it as food. And so we have food pantries. We haven't really thought about that as housing. So I think those are, it's a fundamental piece to connect for our community with housing and homelessness. The last part that I want to say about that, and Hannah, you sort of ended on this too, and that is that we really need to come together as a community, that this does impact all of us. I've been asking in meetings that I'm in, how many of you, for your clients, with people who are working in human services, criminal justice, et cetera, housing or housing stability is a issue that is getting in the way of any of the other work that you're trying to do with the people you're working with, and everybody's hand is up. In school, you'll ask that question and the hands are up everywhere. It's part of what you're speaking of there. But in our community, when we recognize a need and we really put our minds to it, the creativity in this valley and the willingness to do good, if you would, by our neighbors is pretty incredible. And I use that bridge that we built over the Colorado River as an interesting example, because we had some really hard years of struggle to do an amazing, huge project that involved everybody had to have some kind of sacrifice and input in our whole valley. And we got it done. But it was because we came together and recognized the need finally and said, we'll do it. So I think there is so much possibility. We have barely tapped the resources and ways we can approach, if you would, the homeless piece of this.
Thanks, Debbie. I want to touch back
Gracias,
on
Debbie.
one thing that you
Y
mentioned,
quiero
which was
regresar a una
housing
de las cosas
first,
que tú comentaste, que es acerca de la vivienda.
which is that for a long time, we didn't really understand the solution to chronic homelessness. People that you mentioned, the folks that are under the bridge or camping out and staying out long periods of time, people who sometimes were typically exhibiting mental health or substance abuse issues. And our traditional way of dealing with them was try to sort of work them through the system where they would sort of earn their housing. And we were having really bad outcomes with that, spending a lot of money. Cities were spending lots of money with people cycling through the jail system, the mental health system, things like that. And people discovered that when you took folks in those situations and put them in housing and then offered them services, that they had an 80% success rate or more, and that was saving millions of dollars in communities. One particular study was done on this one guy in Asheville, North Carolina, the state where I lived previously. Not a huge community, but over the course of a year, they had tracked $1 million worth of public expense to his cycling in and out of the system versus getting him into a unit, into what they called a permanently supportive housing unit with a housing voucher, and then we're able to offer services and then get him into employment situations. And it was a dramatic reduction in cost. And so these kind of interventions that we know work and can save significant money and can have lasting benefits for both the capacity of folks being better utilized, but also improving the quality of life for our communities, are that much more difficult when you have such a significant housing shortage. And everybody in communities like Glenwood and larger is really struggling to find these permanent supportive housing units and to be able to respond to these kind of challenges in a way that both is effective but also extremely efficient. With that, I want to pivot back to Katherine to talk a little bit more about housing stability. We've talked about it a couple of times, and Katherine, I know you've done some research work on that and sort of the importance of both that issue and sort of what it means for folks.
Yeah, I mean, at Aspen FSP, there are a lot of issues that we work on, and all of them are important. But really, if you don't have housing that you can depend on, where you feel safe, whether that is because of the conditions of the housing or the conditions of the neighborhood, that allows you to work because you can access jobs either through transit or through reasonable car ownership and access proximity, you have to have that piece of housing in place for everything else to work. And that is the reason that, as you mentioned, it is so cost effective to address homelessness. It is a problem that affects everyone in a community because of those costs, and because no one feels satisfied when that is a problem in their community, and people may have different reasons for being dissatisfied with it, but there's a lot of interest in doing something, because everyone understands that there's some type of cost to them. And you mentioned kids not being able to work as well in school and workers not being able to perform as well at work. One of the things that's really striking in the research is the impact on kids. If a family is forced to move, whether that is like a formal eviction or an informal eviction, which is also a pretty common phenomenon, they are more likely to start missing significant periods of school. They are less likely to be promoted at the end of the year to the next grade. And it lasts for years. That can happen to your family for a short period in elementary school. And if you really get disconnected from what you need, you are less likely to graduate from high school, and thus less likely to earn the amount of money that you need to support yourself and a family over your lifetime. And most people don't like the idea of the children in their community, their neighbors and their neighbors' kids facing that risk. So there are a lot of reasons to think about this as a problem to come together on. And I think you mentioned some other systems that really come into play here. Health is another one, and the criminal justice system. Both of those things get more stress and more unfunded costs than they can handle because of problems that we could solve closer to the source. So 2 additional things around homeless populations that I wanted to bring up. It is largely, particularly more than in the past, people who are working or who have some connections to employment. Often it is becoming homeless itself that causes job loss. And then you kind of get into a spiral where if you don't have a fixed address, and if you can't afford to keep your phone on all the time, it becomes very difficult to become reemployed, which is one of those reasons that rapid rehousing and housing first models can be so helpful. And then on the side of people who experience chronic homelessness, they are the hardest folks to help because they have the deepest and most extensive problems. That said, a permanent supportive housing approach has really been shown to be successful, not just in your community where you've tried it, but elsewhere. That is something that, you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy earlier, and having that housing in place can be what allows you to show up consistently at rehab and therapy to get help for your substance abuse issues. It can be the thing, a lot of people who end up with chronic homelessness challenges are physically disabled, and there's no housing that they can even access. So that also is something that just ensuring that people have a place to live that they can count on, even if it's very modest, just makes all the difference in the world for their own lives and for communities. And I think that might be a good place to leave it and move on to more questions.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things I want to get back to that sort of started with Hannah's piece, which is thinking about the kind of change crucible that Glenwood's in right now. I talked about some of the macro housing dynamics, but you've got the challenge of being a place people want to live and employers want to come is a problem a lot of communities would like to have. But it does bring challenges, and people are not coming to Glenwood because Debbie's got a whole array of services. They're coming here because employers, there are jobs here, and there's a high quality of life here. And you're also in a good location in that you can get the experience of a more rural life, but still be on an interstate and get to other places in the state and access other amenities. Travel is typically a significant barrier to population growth in a lot of rural communities. So those challenges are ones that you, in a sense, want to have as a community, but they do quickly become dramatic changes to the quality of life if you can't respond to them. And I think Hannah talked about a couple of those, and I wanted to just bring that back of, the reality is if employers keep struggling to hire folks over an extended period of time, you then don't become such a great place to do business. And people start to think about where else can I go, or other folks don't come. And the more people that, in a sense, are living somewhere else and coming into your community for work, the more, I think, Hannah, you mentioned a population, a cost to that, but it's the more the cost of losing out on investment and money circulating through your local economy grows significantly. And often communities don't recognize, they may recognize the traffic dynamic of not having enough housing in our community because folks are commuting in, but the actual economic expense is also significant because folks are spending their weekend, in a sense, where they go to the grocery store and buy things in other communities, not necessarily in the place where they work. There's also the dynamic of the school system and, the performance that both Debbie and I think Katherine talked about of how kids do in school. When you have a significant amount of housing instability, you start to see school performance decline and school dropout rates increase. And so that, again, creates a quality of life dynamic and a sort of community well-being dynamic that, the education system is not really set up to deal with housing challenges. But when you talk to teachers and school counselors, they will tell you that's a significant concern for the kids that are struggling. And I think Debbie had mentioned that as well. So Hannah, in terms of the employment conversation, have there been conversations with employers about how they think about where housing needs to go or what kind of housing needs to get built? Or are those the conversations that you guys are really looking to move into?
I think we're definitely starting to have more of those conversations as businesses are coming to the city and asking for very creative solutions. I won't go into some of those, but we get quite a few of, can you do this? Can this be accommodated here? We have this need. So I think we're kind of at a tipping point for that conversation. And my work with the Housing Commission, the city from a municipal standpoint has been putting in a lot of work to try and find these solutions regulatorily, as well as incentivizing developers to build. But we have employers that have voiced interest in the partnering. If you build it, can I purchase some of the units so that I can use it for my employees? We're seeing a lot more of that come out, which is also a great problem to have, of people wanting to partner, right? And so some of those conversations is figuring out from the city side, how do we partner effectively to get units on the ground for these businesses or provide a different area to accommodate what they're looking for. But it would be great, and we're not the first community by any stretch of the imagination. It would be great to see examples from other communities who've been a little bit further in these conversations on the business side, because that's a great driver to have when you've got your businesses that are actually stepping up to the plate and wanting to partner to help the issue as it relates to them, but it also benefiting the community.
Yeah, that's a great, I think we're going to segue into Q&A in a minute, but I think that the idea of partnership and understanding that that employers are really engaged, I think it leads really into that community conversation about character and change, because often you may come up with innovative ideas, but if folks are sort of locked into like, I don't want to see any new development, or I don't want to see this change, it becomes, employers can sort of lose hope and energy on that. I mean, their job, they didn't go into business to develop housing either. And so they're coming at this from a place of crisis, and they want to see movement and support. And that's really where I think Glenwood is in this unique moment in time. You've got, it's easy to fixate on the challenges, but to look at all the assets and strengths of the community, and this opportunity to sort of come together and have a vision about where we want to be in 5 years, where we want to be in 10 years, and how we can collaborate on solving this issue, because it can't just be go off and do this and let us know, because it'll take different land use strategies. It'll take different transportation strategies. It'll take thinking about not just density, but how we make sure that housing and services and retail and stuff are closer together, so that we're not getting locked into sort of weird zoning distinctions that prohibit development. And we're thinking about how human services is a part of that conversation and not sort of just coming in after the fact. So there are a lot of communities that are grappling with these same issues and have come up with some interesting partnerships. But the number one lesson that I always learn from communities is that if you come together in this collaborative spirit of dialogue and understanding the issues and how we're all in this together, it's a lot easier to find, because there's no one magic bullet, and that you'll need an array of solutions to think about, and taking advantage of every opportunity housing-wise for new development that can fit the right way you want to do it is a key element of change. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Evan, I think, for us to shift into the Q&A portion, and we will go a little further.
Thank you all so much. This is such a complex issue. You've covered so much ground. I've got a few questions here, several actually, but a few that I want to ask. This one is my favorite one, and it's something that I've been thinking about since the start of the pandemic and haven't heard really anything about, and maybe it's just because I haven't been paying attention. Why isn't, and this is for all of you, why isn't there more pressure on the banks to take some of the pressure off of regular families and the national workforce through housing subsidies and deferred mortgage payments? Why hasn't there been more of an effort to put pressure on the banks to pick up some of the slack here, so that we're not constantly trying to like play catch up among the working class who in many cases have lost their incomes through no fault of their own? Does anybody want to take a stab at that, or does anybody have any insight? And this one might seem out of left field, but it's something that I've actually been thinking about for a long time.
I can
Katherine, you have something you want to, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I will start off just by saying my wife lost her job at the beginning of the pandemic last year, and we took advantage of the mortgage forbearance that did exist for that purpose. And it was easy because I have worked in housing for almost 15 years. And I don't know that it would have been super easy for people who didn't already know exactly where to go for help. And also knew exactly the ins and outs of how to participate without having it negatively affect my credit or anything. And, you know, she was okay in a couple of months. It wasn't a huge crisis, but not having to worry about our housing costs during that time, like priceless. You know, like we're new young homeowners, and that's a very serious, scary thing to face. So we did have some things in place. You had to be able to navigate a system to do it. And while those programs are still in place, they will definitely be allowed to expire this year. So I do think that it is fair to say that we didn't do enough on that front. On the positive side, we did process-wise so much better than in the Great Recession, where we tried to help people in some ways with forbearance, with modifications, and it just was a mess because we didn't know what we were doing. And we were able to successfully apply those lessons. In contrast, a lot of the people who are struggling are small landlords, and their mortgages weren't eligible for deferral a lot of the time because they weren't necessarily backed by Fannie and Freddie, or they had a different type of loan than the ones that were covered. And, you know, the renters out there were most likely to lose their jobs or have permanently reduced income over the last 18 months. And that is hard. You know, I think putting that eviction moratorium in place saved literally 10,000 lives nationwide. And given that, it seems hard to say it wasn't worth it. But on the other hand, I really feel for those small, independent, mom and pop type landlords who just have not gotten the support that they need. And I'm really hoping that, number one, we never have a crisis like this again. But number two, that next time we do have a crisis, that lots of renters have lost income at one time, that we're able to learn from it the way that we did with homeowners after the recession.
Yeah, Evan, that's a great question. And I think Katherine did a great job of talking about the eviction moratorium was a pretty key strategy to not create further upheaval in the market. And it's easier in some ways to sort of push on the banking system than it is, as Katherine pointed out, to push on the rental housing system. And I do think we are going to see some pretty significant fallout from the eviction moratorium ending, just because there are a lot of people who are not caught up in terms of either their debt or their employment, or the employment they can get is not going to meet the rental need. And that is going to be a challenge for us going forward. As Katherine mentioned, we did learn some stuff from 2008, but she hit it totally on the head that the biggest missing piece is really understanding the business side of the landlord market. And it's one thing for a large commercial company that does huge scale apartments to sort of figure out have a strategy. But again, for small, mom and pop landlords, as Katherine referred to them, they need to be seen as a small business that's eligible for financial relief. And we weren't, I think, fully aware and ability to understand that, I think, in the early stages of the pandemic, and they're trying to play catch up with that now with new investments that the new administration has put forward. But it's hard. I think we're going to have some shockwaves in the coming months because we're still having trouble getting a lot of that rental assistance money out the door.
Well, I want to follow up with something that you just mentioned. This is another question. With federal and state stimulus funds imminently pouring into the region from the American Rescue Plan Act, what are the one or two strategies public officials might consider that are most likely to bring the greatest return on investment over time?
I'll offer my assessment, and I will add, I will throw in the chat a link that we have on our webpage to all of the federal resources available that we are tracking for rural communities that folks in the region should know about. I think given that the stimulus money is a one-time infusion, particularly the rescue plan, thinking about particularly infrastructure investments and investments that you can make that may address long-standing issues of equity, places that maybe hadn't seen as much development, or some ways to address some systemic issues that you don't often have the resources to look at, I think are one of the best ways to approach particularly the rescue plan funding, I think, that we're encouraging folks to think about. But also it's an opportunity to do particularly some strategic planning and listening for communities to think about what can we do with these to address this particular challenge of housing. Are there some infrastructure investments that are going to make that easier to do? Whether it's water and sewer or electrical or things like that. How do we think about transportation options differently? Where do we want to see growth occur in our community, and how do we support that? And then there's, I think, a level down, which is how do we funnel this money into places that need it most? Particularly, often the folks who can fill out applications have the most capacity. And so the smaller business owners, particularly business owners in immigrant communities or who don't necessarily have the same access to capital and resources, thinking intentionally about how to connect that support to them, I think is another sort of unique opportunity with this moment. So I'll pause with that, and I don't know if Hannah or anyone else wants to, or Katherine wants to add to that.
If no one else has a thought on that, that's okay. I've got something that sort of dovetails with that nicely. Talking about priorities and how we prioritize some of that spending. With the full spectrum of geopolitics in Glenwood Springs and the surrounding communities, how do we get community members and public officials to come to the table on these complex issues? How do we strengthen common ground in an effort to move towards tangible solutions for all members of the political spectrum? Are there any suggestions on how to move some of that forward?
I would love to hear from Hannah and Debbie a little bit about community specifics, but one of the things that I have seen work well in communities with a lot of different dimensions of diversity is a group of civic leaders working on the problem at a high level and saying like, hey, here's the problem. We can agree on what it is. Now let's talk about what we all need out of solutions. And when there's agreement that this is a problem we're going to address from the beginning, there's a lot of room for collaboration among those partners to say like, we're decided on the thing that we're going to do something. Let's take it from there. And that's a place where employers sometimes feel like a lot more comfortable engaging because they're not necessarily becoming housing developers, but they are exploring all of those issues with other people who may be developers. That's a place where it's easier to convene and hear from local developers who are not necessarily the huge institutional, like, I actually don't know if Toll Brothers is out there, but I know they're one of the biggest ones on the East Coast. Like, it's not that, it's people who have a couple of, licensed general contractors and a team of people who know what they're doing, who are constructing relatively small scale housing. And their voices are really critical because they're the people who, in communities that are looking for growth that is kind of, let's make it denser, let's make it easier to connect people to jobs and resources by being closer, but let's not completely change everything. They're the people who will be doing the building. And I think, that means that if you have business and builders in a room together with people who also deeply care about ending homelessness, ensuring security, ensuring that kids have real opportunities, like those are forums where I've seen good things happen. The county that includes Minneapolis has one called the Itasca Project that I think is an interesting, good model. And then actually, Bentonville, home of the Walmart empire, they have started out as a tiny town and have grown a lot because of that major employer. And for them, growing in a way that would work for everyone in that community while allowing Walmart and all of the businesses that located around it to have the workforce that they wanted was really, something that has taken a lot of deliberate work. So both of those are places that may have some interesting and relevant models for y'all.
Last question. I don't know if there's an easy answer to this. This year, we've seen unprecedented increases in the cost of homes throughout the region. How do we mitigate the skyrocketing cost of housing in the region? Anybody have any insight on that one? I mean,
one there, Evan.
what's that?
I said you really ended on an easy one there, Evan.
Solve affordability.
Yeah.
I'll mention just two broad things and then turn it over to, I think, Hannah and Debbie. But part of it is understanding that looking at every way to create the flexibility of housing provision. So a lot of places would get caught up on like people couldn't convert garage apartments to rental units, for example, as a way, it's just you're holding back a certain stock. So the flexibility of sort of how to get housing on the ground and how to help people utilize what they have. The second piece is a little harder, which is looking at what the short-term rental market is. because the Airbnb market, so to speak, consumes a huge amount of housing stock in desirable communities, particularly that have access to recreation. And that is taking that stock away from your year-round workforce. And a lot of communities are really having to take that head on, whether that's you're limiting it, or you're asking for registration, or you're collecting fees that's then used into affordable housing fund. But that's a real issue that I think people have to look at in communities like Glenwood and in the valley as a whole, because of the amenities of the place. And when you're losing, as Hannah can point out, it's a really tough treadmill to be in when you're trying to catch up to the shortage of housing stock you've got to begin with. But when you're losing housing that's sort of going out of the market to folks who aren't in the workforce, that's problematic. It also means you have to think creatively about how the hospitality industry can adequately meet the demand for tourism, because you don't want to say no one should come here. But we sort of default to, well, a bunch of people got to rent their homes. That kind of took the pressure off, but like, oh, now it's a whole lot more expensive to rent here. And so you've got to think about it as a system of moving pieces. And again, that's part of that conversation that everybody has to be in together to see the connected parts, and not just, if you do this, this is bad for me, or this is good for me. So with that, Hannah, if you have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a lot of the things. I know we're just about out of time. I think one of the strong points that Glenwood as a city has been doing is looking at those regulatory options for removing barriers. And we have done quite a bit of good work, I would say, actually, in our vacation rental market that you spoke about. I looked at our numbers since we instituted some new regulations with that very delicate balance of a conversation. And we had 134 vacation rentals approximately 2 years ago. And with our regulations, we are down to 112. So we've seen a balance there. They're still here, but we're moderating that. And we've also taken that approach in some of our other codes. And now the city is actually considering city-owned parcels to try and contribute to that land aspect to get that price down. It's very small scale given the parcels that we do own, but it is something that the city is looking at. And so I think we're having these tough conversations, but we're working in those aspects and looking to see the success stories of other communities that have also come before us in removing some of those barriers to get the price point down a little bit. What I can say is, I don't think any one solution is going to make that huge difference. So continuing to use all the tools and working with Debbie and getting great ideas from you guys is wonderful to hear from a senior planner position. So thank you for this.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of you for joining today's inaugural Hurst Community Initiative Town Hall Speaker Series. This presentation was the 5th of 8 webinar events, broadcasting every 2 weeks now through the end of July. You're invited to register for more events in this series at aspen2parachute.org/events. And that's the number 2, aspen2parachute.org/events. Our next presentation, co-hosted by the Parachute Branch Library and the West Garfield County Chamber of Commerce, will be Tuesday, June 29th from noon to 1 p.m. Mountain Time on the topic of Parachute, a case study in rural economic development. And I am very pleased to say that we're going to get Chris Estes back one more time. He's going to be moderating for us. Again, he's the Associate Director for Aspen Institute's Community Strategies Group. We'll also be joined by Roy McClung, who's the Mayor of Parachute, Colorado, along with Claudia Flores Cruz, who's the Garfield School District 16 School Resource Center Coordinator. You can register for the remaining events in this series and find more information on the Aspen Institute's initiatives to engage with the communities of the Roaring Fork and Colorado River Valleys at aspen2parachute.org. I'm Evan Zislis. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.